The book of Revelation was written on a small rocky island in the Aegean Sea by an elderly man who had been exiled there by the Roman Emperor Domitian as punishment for his Christian faith. The island was called Patmos. It was approximately 10 miles long and 6 miles wide, volcanic, largely barren, used by Rome as a penal colony for those whose beliefs or activities were considered dangerous to the empire. The man's name was John. He was a fisherman's son from the Galilean village of Bethsaida, and he was possibly the last surviving member of the 12 disciples who had walked with Jesus. John had no scientific education. He had no exposure to engineering principles. He had never seen electricity, had no concept of electromagnetic radiation, had never heard of a satellite or a microprocessor, or a global communications network. He was an elderly Jewish fisherman in exile on a barren island, receiving a series of visions that were so overwhelming and so far outside the framework of any human experience that he struggled throughout the book to find language adequate to describe them. He did his best. He described what he saw using the categories and vocabulary available to him in the 1st century: beasts and dragons, and lampstands and horses, and bowls and seals, imagery drawn from the Old Testament prophets, particularly Ezekiel and Daniel, recontextualized in ways that his original readers could partially grasp. And for 19 centuries after he wrote it down, the book of Revelation was read primarily as symbolic literature, a coded message to persecuted 1st century Christians about the ultimate vindication of God over Rome, or as eschatological theology about the end of history expressed in metaphorical terms. But something has been happening in the last 30 to 40 years that is changing the way certain passages in Revelation read. Not all of them, not the symbolic and theological dimensions that have always been there, but certain specific, concrete, operational descriptions of how specific things would work in practical terms, have begun to look increasingly less like poetic metaphor and increasingly more like technical description. And the reason they look this way is not that interpreters have found hidden codes or applied exotic hermeneutics to squeeze new meanings out of old texts. It is simply that the technology we live with every day has come to match in its operational characteristics. What John described from his prison island 2,000 years ago. Let us start with the passage that is perhaps the most striking example. Revelation chapter 11, verses 7 through 10. John is describing 2 witnesses who will prophesy in Jerusalem for 1,260 days. At the end of that period, a figure John calls the beast kills them. Their bodies lie in the street of the great city. And then John writes this: for 3.5 days, some from every people, tribe, language, and nation will gaze on their bodies and refuse them burial. The inhabitants of the earth will gloat over them and celebrate and send each other gifts, because these 2 prophets had tormented those who live on the earth. Read that description carefully and precisely. Some from every people, tribe, language, and nation will gaze on their bodies, not people in Jerusalem, not people in the Roman Empire, every people, every tribe, every language, every nation, simultaneously gazing on 2 specific bodies in a specific street in Jerusalem for 3.5 days, and not just observing passively. They are celebrating, gloating, sending each other gifts in response to what they are seeing. For 19 centuries after John wrote those words, this was a physical impossibility, not a difficult thing to arrange, not something requiring unusual resources. Literally impossible. There was no mechanism by which people in China and Africa and the Americas could simultaneously observe what was happening in a specific street in Jerusalem in real time. The fastest communication in the ancient world was a messenger on a fast horse. News that something had happened in Jerusalem might reach Rome in a few weeks, Nadi Egypt in a few days, Britain in a month or more. It would reach what is now China or Brazil never, or after so many months that the event would be ancient history. Even through most of the modern era, the technology for what John describes did not exist. Radio could broadcast audio to wide audiences, but not live visual footage of a specific location to every nation simultaneously. Early television was limited to viewers with receivers receivers in range of broadcast towers. Satellite television expanded reach, but still required specific infrastructure and access. Then, in the late 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s and 2010s, something changed. The internet reached global penetration. Smartphone cameras became universal. Streaming platforms emerged that could carry live video from a single camera to every internet-connected device on Earth simultaneously. In 2015, a shooting in a specific street in a specific city was broadcast live on social media to millions of viewers in dozens of countries before the police had even arrived on the scene. In 2021, a major event in a city center was watched live by over 100 million people. In 2024, events in Gaza and Ukraine were documented in real time by people on the ground, watched simultaneously by viewers in Australia, Canada, Japan, Brazil, Nigeria, and every other country with internet access. The operational description John gave of people from every people, tribe, language, and nation gazing on a specific event in Jerusalem became technically feasible for the first time in human history within the last 30 years. Not metaphorically feasible, literally, operationally, mechanically feasible. The infrastructure now exists. The thing John described, which was impossible for 1,970 years, could happen tomorrow. Now consider Revelation chapter 13 and the mark of the beast. John describes a system in which a specific authority, the one he calls the beast, requires every person to receive a mark on their right hand or forehead, and no one could buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This passage has been interpreted across centuries in terms of whatever economic control system was dominant in each era. Roman coin marks, medieval guild seals, 20th century social security numbers, Nazi identification tattooed on concentration camp prisoners. Every generation found its own version of the mark of the beast in the control systems of its day. But the specific operational characteristic John describes, an entirely cashless economic system in which every transaction requires verification against a central identifier, and in which that verification can be denied or granted based on the bearer's relationship. This was genuinely impossible in any previous era. Commerce in every previous civilization was fundamentally decentralized. Gold is gold, regardless of whether the central authority approves of the person holding it. Grain is grain. Physical commodity exchange could not be controlled at the transaction level by any central authority, much regardless of how powerful. This changed with the digitization of money. Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, are now being actively developed by more than 130 countries, representing over 98% of global GDP. Several countries have already launched them. China's digital yuan is in broad operational use. The European Central Bank is advancing its digital euro project. The United States Federal Reserve is researching a digital dollar. These systems, by their design, give issuing authorities unprecedented visibility into and control over individual transactions. A government operating a CBDC system could, in principle, restrict the use of funds for certain purposes in certain locations or by certain individuals in real time at the transaction level. The technical architecture of a system where no one can buy or sell without approval from a central authority now exists in prototype form across multiple major economies. It has never existed before. It is being built right now, openly, in financial system white papers and central bank research publications. Then look at Revelation chapter 9, one of the most visually strange passages in the entire book. John describes beings released from the abyss that he struggles to categorize. They had hair like women's hair, teeth like lions, tails and stingers like scorpions. They wore what looked like breastplates of iron. The sound of their wings was like the thundering of many horses and chariots rushing into battle, and they were given power to torment certain people for 5 months, but not to kill them, and specifically not to harm the grass of the earth or any plant or tree, or those who did not have a certain mark. The operational characteristic that makes this passage remarkable is the last detail. These These beings could target specific people. People with certain marks were exempt. People without those marks were targeted. This is not the description of a weapon that kills indiscriminately. This is the description of something that can identify a target and respond differently based on who that target is. Military technology researchers who have read this passage have noted, some cautiously and some with considerable alarm, that autonomous weapons systems, specifically drone swarms, programmed for targeted engagement using facial recognition or biometric identification, would have exactly these operational characteristics. They would appear in the sky in large numbers. They would make significant noise. They could be programmed to target specific individuals and ignore others. They could be programmed to wound rather than kill, and they would be invisible to the distinction between human and animal that previous weapons could not make. The question this raises is not whether Revelation is a military technology manual. It is not. It is a prophetic vision delivered in the symbolic language of first-century Judaism. The question is why a first-century fisherman on a prison island wrote a description of something that matches in its operational characteristics technologies that were not imagined until the 21st century. There is also the mark itself, the biometric identifier, the visible mark on hand or forehead that enables or disables economic participation. The technology for subcutaneous chips, digital tattoos, and biometric payment systems tied to a central identifier exists today. Microchip implants for payment and identification are already in use in several European countries. Biometric data, fingerprints, facial recognition, vein patterns in the hand is already being used for financial authentication by multiple payment processors worldwide. None of these things proves that the end is imminent. Proving imminence was never the purpose of prophecy. The purpose of prophecy is to establish in advance that the events it describes are not accidents of history, but part of a plan whose author stands outside of time, who sees the end from the beginning, who described in the first century what would be operational in the 21st, because he designed both the technology and the timeline. The book of Revelation is not a comfortable book. It describes catastrophe and judgment on a scale that makes every other disaster in human history look like a prelude. But it also ends in a way that John could not have anticipated when he began receiving those visions on Patmos, not in destruction, in renewal, a new heaven and a new earth. The old order of things passed away. No more death, mourning, crying, or pain. God dwelling with his people, personally, directly. The barrier that has existed since the garden completely gone. John, the old fisherman on the prison island, saw it. He wrote it down in the only language he had available to him. And 2,000 years later, the world that has been built in the interval between his writing and our reading is beginning to look, in certain specific technical details, like the world he was describing, not the end of the story. The last chapter before the ending, and the ending, according to the last pages of the last book of the Bible, is not what most people who have only heard the middle of the story are expecting. It is not catastrophe, it is arrival. The arrival, after all of this, of exactly what everything was always moving toward.